we'd like to thank the following sponsors.
Hello, and welcome to this Glass Build Connect session on the new 2020 edition of the ANSI accredited ICC 700 National Green Building Standard and the National Green Building Standard Certification Program, or NGBS Green. My name is Jeff Inks, and I'm Vice President of Advocacy for the Wind and Door Manufacturers Association. And we are very pleased to be a part of the Glass Build Connect virtual conference and to bring you this session. Here to make the presentation is Michelle Foster, who is Vice President of Sustainability for the Home Innovation Research Labs, formerly known as the National Association of Home Builders Research Center. The labs serve as the ANSI accredited secretariat for the development and maintenance of the Green Building Standard, and they also operate the NGBS Green Certification Program there. To briefly introduce you to Michelle, prior to joining the Home Innovations Research Labs, where she has been for the past 12 years and runs the lab's green building and sustainability programs, she has held positions in urban planning, environmental management, land use, and housing finance with the National Capital Planning Commission, Fannie Mae, National Association of Home Builders, and New York City Department of City Planning. She holds a bachelor's in environmental studies and planning from the State University of New York and a master's in urban and environmental planning from the University of Virginia. With that, welcome, Michelle.
Thanks, Jeff. It's my pleasure to be here and talk to everybody about the new 2020 National Green Building Standard. So just to refresh everybody, the National Green Building Standard, ICC 700, is an ANSI approved standard. It is also part of the ICC suite of I-codes, and it can be used as an alternative for compliance for the International Green Construction Codes in those jurisdictions that have adopted that and require that for construction. You can use the National Green Building Standard for all buildings that are used residentially. And I know that that's somewhat awkward language, but I'm going to explain to you what that means and the scope that it covers and the types of buildings that can be used to be compliant with the NGBS. It was originally designed to be a voluntary above code green certification program. One of the benefits is that it is written in code language, which makes it very accessible for everyone who works on construction sites and construction projects, whether it's architects or contractors, builders and developers, but it's used primarily around the country as a voluntary above code program. And it is nationally the most used green building certification program. That's a little known fact that I love to share with everybody. If you would like to have a copy and you have not downloaded it yet, it is available for free download at builderbooks.com. So just to give you some idea, the National Green Building Standard has been around for about 10 years, and Home Innovation, as Jeff mentioned, has been serving as adopting entity, issuing green building certifications for around the same period of time. We started in 2010, and this chart gives a good representation of how the program has grown over the 10 years. You can see we've done fairly well in single-family homes, as represented by the yellow part of the pie chart, part of the bars. And then for multifamily buildings in the blue, that has definitely been the bulk of the program. We've done lots of multifamily buildings, ranging anywhere from garden-style multifamily up to 70-story high-rises in New Jersey. This slide is also important, and I like to show it. I just pulled this off of our website where we keep a real-time counter, if you're ever interested in going to see it, at homeinnovation.com/green. So you can see over the 10 years, we've done about just over 17,000 single-family homes, which is not bad. We think we can do better. I think there's great opportunity in the 2020 for us to be able to do better, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But there's no question that the success of the program has been in multifamily, with almost 200,000 new apartments that have been certified and over 7,600 apartments in renovated buildings. Important to note as well, we only recently started breaking out the number of renovated buildings and apartments from multifamily, because in the last few years there's just been an explosion of those existing buildings coming to the program seeking certification as they're doing renovation. But the other thing I want to point out from this slide as well is you can see the numbers of in-process single-family homes and multifamily buildings. And that number has continued to grow, particularly in the last few years. One of the hallmarks of our program is we have a very low dropout rate. So typically if a project does register, and there's no fee for registration for our program, but if a project does register, it almost always will end up at the end of the process getting certified. So we feel pretty strong that these numbers, these buildings that are in process, will go through the entire process and ultimately get certified. Just to go back again for the history to give you some context, the very first version that was created and developed and ANSI approved was the 2008 version. That is now retired. Nobody can use that. The next version was the 2012 National Green Building Standard. That deadline for registration for projects to use that has passed. We have some projects still in the pipeline that are seeking certification to the 2012, depending on what state they're in. Their construction deadlines will be coming up in either 2021 or 2022. But really the most commonly used version right now is the 2015 NGBS. The vast majority of registrations we're taking right now is to the 2015 NGBS. And then what I'm really here to speak to you about today is the recently ANSI approved 2020 NGBS, which is available now. Registration opened mid-April. We have a couple of projects that have already registered for the 2020, and we're really excited to see this move forward, particularly because some of the improvements and revisions from the 2015. As a reminder for how a building can earn certification and be compliant with the National Green Building Standard, there are mandatory practices which there are no exemptions for, and typically they do not earn points for that building. So in order for a building to be certified, they must comply with those mandatory practices, and that's going to ensure that baseline building performance across all the buildings that we're certifying around the country. Then the bulk of the National Green Building Standard is comprised of voluntary practices. They earn points towards certification. In general, those points are based on the difficulty level or the cost of the practice. And again, a hallmark of the NGBS is that it is not just a design-based rating system. There are practices at the design stage, but there's also product and system selection. So for example, as we were talking earlier, the importance for window and door manufacturers, the types of doors and windows that are selected and used in the building, and construction-based practices, because we want to make sure that what the architects are designing and what they're speccing is actually getting into the building. And so we have a very rigorous on-site inspection protocol that is required for certification. The other thing that sets the standard apart is that there are minimum points required in each of the 6 green building categories. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit of depth because that makes the NGBS very comprehensive, and it also makes it probably the most rigorous green building rating system being used today in the United States. And then, as I mentioned, we have that 100% third-party on-site verification. So this chart really is key in understanding the National Green Building Standard and how it works and how it sets itself apart from the other rating system. So if you can look across the top row, you'll see the 4 different certification levels that are possible: bronze, silver, gold, or emerald. And then if you look down in that middle fat column, those are the 6 categories of green building practices. And now there's nothing unusual here: energy efficiency, water efficiency. If you were to look at any of the other green building programs, you're going to see the same categories. But what really sets the NGBS apart is that there are minimum point requirements for each of these 6 categories, and the building is going to be judged by the lowest score. So for example, you must hit, if you're going for silver, 64 points in lot design, 39 points in water efficiency. Let's say your building can hit the 300 and let's say 40 points for silver, can hit all the point thresholds for everything, but maybe for water efficiency you're at 35 points. The entire building would be certified at bronze. So you're going to be judged by your lowest score. This really makes the NGBS very comprehensive. An architect or a developer can't just get all of their points in one specific category of practice. Having said that, lots of rigor, lots of flexibility. And I know that sounds like a contradiction, but let me explain why. So if you were to look down at the bottom, for example, the total points required for certification, 231 for bronze, 334 for silver, for example, that is out of over 1,100 points to choose from. So while it's very rigorous for figuring out how a building is compliant and having to meet these minimum requirements, there are lots of practices and points available for a building to get certified. So what this means is that an architect, developer, whoever is providing the specifications for the building really has lots of choices to make the decisions that they need to for the type of building. Is it affordable? Is it market rate? Is it mid-rise, high-rise, or it may be garden style, depending on what climate zone it is. Whatever the really needs of that building is, there are practices that that particular architect, developer, owner can find to be able to make the points. So very unusual in some ways, very rigorous, but also lots of flexibility at the same time. So as I mentioned, the 2020 National Green Building Standard was in development for the last 3 years, recently approved by ANSI just this past January, and then became available for certification in April. And a number of really big changes that we're going to talk about today. First and foremost, the scope was expanded to really include a wider variety of residential uses. The Consensus Committee really wanted to make sure that any buildings that we were living in and had sleeping accommodations, such as assisted living, extended stay hotels, could be included in the scope. There was a new water efficiency performance path added. I'm not going to talk much about that today, but that was a new way to be able to be compliant with water efficiency. And then an entirely new certification level for single-family homes, townhouses, and duplexes. One of the other big changes was that previously the NGBS could only be used for multifamily buildings or the residential portion of mixed-use buildings, and the 2020 NGBS now expands that to allow mixed-use buildings, so long as the commercial area is not more than 49% of the whole building, to be certified in its entirety. And that was really a reflection of the fact that many of the buildings that we are building today are mixed use. There's often 1 or 2 floors of retail and commercial on the bottom of a multifamily building, and we want to be able to certify those buildings. And again, flexible, but very rigorous and more flexible for provisions for renovation. So, and I'll be talking about that specifically as well. Very important is the baseline of the 2020 NGBS are the 2018 codes. So the 2018 IECC, the 2018 IRC, and the 2018 IBC. So again, if you were to go into the 2020 NGBS, most of the mandatory provisions that you'll see there are going to be provisions that are coming out of these 3 codes: the IBC, the IRC, and the IECC, the 2018 version. And that sets the baseline for across the country as we're certifying buildings. There are numerous references to these codes in the 2020 NGBS. And importantly, for the certification program that we run, if a local jurisdiction has made an amendment, so they have adopted the 2018 codes, but they have somehow amended it in any way, for the NGBS Green Certification Program, that is irrelevant. We are making sure that these buildings are compliant with the 2018 IECC, IRC, and IBC as written by the ICC. So with that, let's start with the NGBS scope expansion and what that meant. So the NGBS always was able to be used for the residential portion of mixed-use buildings, any single-family homes, townhouses, residential buildings, and land developments and subdivisions. What changed in this particular version is an expanded definition of residentially used buildings. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it allowed mixed-use buildings for the entire building to be certified so long as the residential portion was greater than 50% of the gross floor area. When I talk about the definition being changed for residential, what I mean is that it was made to be more expansive and recognizing that there are certain buildings that really have residential-like uses that previously could not meet the definition in the NGBS. And so in particular, we had lots of requests from assisted living, some dormitories, extended stay hotels. These are places, these are buildings that people are really doing the things that you would do in a multifamily building or in a single family home. And so now those buildings are allowed to be certified under the NGBS. So we are able to certify any buildings within the IRC scope, Group R occupancies in the IBC, and then very specifically assisted living facilities, residential board and care facilities. Group I1 occupancy is defined in the IBC are all considered residential, specifically just for the NGBS and the certification program. So these allow us to do things, as I mentioned, like hotels and motels, whether they're extended stay or not, dorms, fraternities, even assisted living facilities. Assisted living facilities in particular has been an area of great growth. We've had lots of requests to have those facilities earn a green certification, but oftentimes if they had, for example, 10 memory care units where those residents did not have the facilities for cooking, they previously could not use the NGBS. So we're really excited about the ability to do more of these types of buildings. One of the things that had to change specifically to allow this was not only have a definition of dwelling unit, which is a unit that has the provisions for sleeping, cooking, sanitation, living, all in one unit, but the provision just to have a sleeping unit where they have some of those provisions, but not all of them. So that was one of the big definitional changes. The next thing I'd like to move to, so that kind of gave you an overview of the big change for the scope. I'd like to move to some of the specific changes for the different chapters of the 2020 and how compliance may be different, maybe a little harder, maybe a little bit more expansive moving forward using the 2020 NGBS. The first chapter for buildings is lot design, preparation, and development. This is really what the builder, the developer is doing on the site. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this really at all. There are no new mandatory practices in this chapter, and there was no changes to the points required for compliance. But there were a number of new practices that were added to the 2020 NGBS, and those were largely based on things to promote walkability and bike storage, shared use vehicles. So many cities have shared use bicycles, shared use cars. There was a recognition that there was some additional issues with concern to fires in that interface between the urban areas and the wildland areas. And then a particular addition in looking at being able to provide points for places that have areas of high intersection density, because we know in those areas people walk a lot more and don't have to depend on their cars. Another thing I'm going to highlight here in this chapter, but it wasn't just really only in the chapter 5, was there was a lot of discussion among the consensus committee members and additional practices added to the NGBS, almost all voluntary, non-mandatory, that really focus on the wellness of occupants. This idea of the places that we live really can impact our health and wellness, and so the things that we do in the construction and design of the buildings can either help or hurt occupants going in the future. So there were a number of practices added that promote recreation, improved indoor air quality, community gardens, and home innovation as part of the NGBS Green Certification Program will be rolling out different ways that building developers and owners can really emphasize those practices that they're putting in place that deal with the wellness of the buildings, because what we know from market research is this is an area that is of particular importance, whether you're a home buyer or a renter. The next chapter in the National Green Building Standard is resource efficiency. This is chapter 6. There were some very significant changes to this particular chapter. First and foremost, there were new mandatory practices that were added. There was new practices with regard to recycling and waste management. There's an entirely new section on product declaration. And interestingly enough, a lot of robust discussion and a new section on resilient construction. Again, something that has been really, I think, in the forefront of green construction and sustainability. How do we make our buildings more resilient going forward? What are the ways that we can promote that? But no threshold point changes for this particular chapter. So again, just to highlight in particular the resilient construction practice that was added, the idea was to make this voluntary. Presumably it would be architects, builders, and developers that would look to potentially use this practice to earn points towards certification if they were in areas where resiliency and durability was an issue. And it can earn up to an additional 15 points towards certification. One of the things that I really like about this practice in this edition for the 2020 is that it really complements HUD's recent disaster recovery funding requirements. So for those of you who may or may not know, all of the HUD disaster recovery funding recently, so in Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico, has had a requirement that in order to use or to access that reconstruction money, the new buildings that are being built or renovated have to be compliant with one of a limited number of green building certification programs, and the National Green Building Standard is one of those programs. So we have started to do quite a bit of work in the Houston area and Puerto Rico, and I think this practice going forward will be a really nice complement to that federal funding and that desirability to sort of look how we can make buildings that we're building now more resilient in the future for threats that are coming up. So you can see there's a choice, and the points are based on how much you're doing for the design to make the building more resilient, ranging from 10% above the base design to 50% above the base design, which would earn you the maximum of 15 additional. In the National Green Building Standard, Chapter 7 has to do with energy efficiency. Again, as a reminder, the baseline performance is going to be the 2018 IECC, but what the Consensus Committee really wanted to do here is provide a little more flexibility for compliance. So they have added a new alternative gold compliance path I'll talk about briefly. They added a new ERI target compliance path and 6 new innovative practices going forward. As a little bit of a review, there are a number of different compliance options that architects and builders and developers have with regard to energy efficiency. They can choose to do the performance path, which is the path that one would use if they're going to be doing modeling to show that the building meets that minimum threshold above the 2018 IECC for bronze and higher levels than that. But there is also the prescriptive path approach, and this is more of a checklist so that as long as that particular building can earn sufficient points by incorporating the practices that are in Chapter 7, they can get certified that way. One of the things, again, that I really like about the NGBS that I think was really just smart on behalf of the Consensus Committee is that using the prescriptive path, a building can earn bronze, silver, or gold, but not emerald. The Consensus Committee really wanted those highest levels, those buildings that were attaining that highest level, that emerald certification, to go through that performance path to use that modeling approach. And so there's a really nice transition path for newer builders coming into the program. Maybe they've not used this green certification program before, to start with the prescriptive path, kind of get used to the program using that checklist approach, and then move to the performance path when they're doing more modeling. In any case, regardless of which path you're using, you're going to have to comply with all the mandatory practices that are in Section 701 of Chapter 7, and then get some additional practices. And again, that really gives us this nice baseline across the country, regardless of where you are and your state and what that requires. And then, as I mentioned, new to the 2020 was the ERI target path. This is available to all levels, bronze, silver, gold, and emerald, and it gives a little more flexibility for, again, builders and developers coming in how to be compliant with Chapter 7. So the performance path, the other thing I think is important to mention is that one of the slight changes that the performance path made in the 2020 NGBS as compared to the 2018 code was that they were very specific to include on-site renewable energy generation, unlike the code. So that can be included in the baseline calculation of whether or not the building is compliant with the minimum performance levels. So there's a lot that you can not only just do the minimum requirements for improvements to envelope, air infiltration, heating, cooling system like the code would require. And we're seeing builders come in and really kind of use that flexibility to be able to get certified. The other thing that was an important add, as I mentioned earlier in my reference to Puerto Rico, was referencing the tropic climate zone that is in the IECC R401.2 and allowing a compliance path there. In many buildings in Puerto Rico or in the Caribbean, it's very common for them to not have any air conditioning at all, or to maybe only air conditioned parts of the building. And so this is sort of recognition that those buildings are very low energy and should still be able to achieve certification. There were also very specific window recognition requirements for the tropical zone. Again, understanding that those buildings often don't have HVAC, or they're not conditioned spaces, and they have different window types they're using. As I mentioned, there's the prescriptive path, which is more of a checklist approach for compliance. There are a number of new things that were added to this. ELR was added as an alternative to ACH to calculate the building envelope leakage. In particular, ACH can be less favorable to smaller houses or smaller units. So this was a recognition that obviously apartments, multifamily buildings, and smaller houses can be more sustainable because they are smaller. There's also a clarification with regard to the UA and SHGC requirements that has to be met when doing the UA analysis, and they updated those fenestration requirements to the 2018 IECC requirements as consistent with the other updates from the 2015 NGBS. And again, added some clarifying language in a tropical exemption for the UA improvement. And then last, for Chapter 7, there were 6 new innovative practices that you can see here as alternative ways to earn additional points towards certification and perhaps achieve some of those higher levels of certification for that particular building. We were really excited in particular to also see third-party utility benchmarking added. Many of you may know that HUD has a very significant mortgage insurance premium reduction for buildings that earn a green certification, including NGBS Green. One of the requirements they have, in addition to getting the green certification to be eligible for that MIP reduction, is that you do have to use Portfolio Manager to benchmark your building's energy usage. And so again, nice synergy here with this practice, so that when a building owner commits to doing that, they would also get points towards certification for their NGBS Green certification. Chapter 8 is water efficiency. A number of new practices here. I mentioned there's a new water performance path. I'm not going to talk about that today. We do have lots of information if you are interested in that on our website. There were no threshold point changes, but as you would expect, there were a lot of changes to either the points available for a particular practice or the flow rate for the fixture that would be eligible to earn those green points. Chapter 9 is indoor environmental quality. This chapter had some new mandatory practices that will be important for architects and builders and developers to know about, particularly with regard to radon testing being mandatory and ventilation for multifamily common spaces. There also was quite a bit of new voluntary practices added that give points towards certification. Increasingly, as important as energy efficiency is, we're finding in our market research that indoor air quality, again, this idea tied to wellness of a building, is really becoming more and more important. And honestly, I certainly think that it will be going forward with COVID-19 and the other concerns we've had in the last few months. There's a new practice with regard to sound barrier, particularly as we build more and more multifamily buildings, concerns about being able to have it be quiet between units. And so this has been new to the NGBS. We've not had this before. And then some new practices, as I mentioned, for the furnishings that go into the common area, and then for ventilation of the common areas in multifamily. Chapter 10 is operation and maintenance. One of the things that really sets the NGBS apart, again, is that training of the building owner and the maintenance staff is required. Being able to provide them with all the information they need to keep those buildings operating at that high performing level that they should be, I think is super important. You can't just turn the building over with lots of the state-of-the-art equipment and expect that it would continue to be able to perform that way unless the staff is trained and they have the right operation manuals and information. For the 2020, what was new is that occupants now have to receive a manual and get trained. So previous versions always recognized that building staff needed that information, and now there's been a recognition that occupants should have that information as well. sorry about that, I flipped to Chapter 11. Chapter 11 is remodeling. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen huge growth in the number of existing buildings that are coming into the program to seek certification. The Consensus Committee for the 2020 NGBS really rewrote Chapter 11 considerably to do a number of things to address some of the problems that previous buildings had in earning certification and to provide even more flexibility going forward. We've seen the renovation chapter used not only for existing multifamily buildings that are being updated and upgraded, perhaps Class A space being moved back into Class A space, but also lots of conversions. So former office buildings, former industrial buildings that are being converted into new apartments and wanting to be able to get that NGBS green certification for their new occupants coming forward. There's a lot of reasons, I think, for this. I mentioned the HUD mortgage insurance premium reduction, the increased valuation that they've seen for new construction, and then improved marketability for those buildings. And so we think in the future, this will continue to be a really big growth area for the program going forward. Chapter 11 works a little bit different than the rest of the NGBS, just to review with everybody. Unlike new construction, which uses chapters 5 through 10, all of the remodeling requirements are embodied within Chapter 11 itself. For the most part, the Chapter 11 practice numbers will parallel those for new construction. So for example, if 505 is stormwater management in Chapter 5, that same practice would be brought over to Chapter 11 as 11.505. There is a requirement for existing buildings to comply with all the mandatory practices in Chapter 11. However, there is an exemption that they're only required to be complied with if it is relevant. So the example that I always use is if you are going and doing a moderate rehab of a building, one of the practices that's mandatory in the NGBS is that you have to ensure the appropriate tile-backed material in a bathroom or any wet area. If the developer or the owner is not renovating or rehabbing the bathroom area, they do not have to go back and rip that up and change it just to be compliant. The verifier will have to come in and they'll have to inspect that property and make sure there are no safety or moisture issues. They would have to do it if there's any moisture issues present. But as long as it's otherwise fine, then we don't want them to rip out things that don't need to be ripped out. So the mandatory practices are only required if they're relevant. And then also importantly, if there is an attribute of the building that can comply before the remodel and it would remain in compliance after the renovation, they can earn points for that. So for example, again, just to provide something off the top of my head, if there's a community garden already at that property, they're going to leave the community garden, they can still get points for having that community garden. Chapter 11 and in the NGBS for renovation really works well with renovation, and it really works well for historic buildings where there may be requirements that they can't change the facade of the building or the windows of the building, but they need a path towards compliance or have some other restrictions, and it works really well with anything from moderate to gut rehabs. So the point system is a little bit different as well, and I'll explain that in a minute. Until the 2020 NGBS, there was only a performance path for water and energy. And one of the changes in the 2020 was that it adds for water and energy efficiency both a performance path or a prescriptive path. So that's some new flexibility that we have going. But otherwise, for the other categories of practices, rather than point minimums in each chapter, there's just these cumulative points. So for a building to be compliant, and let's say it was looking to earn just bronze, for the other chapters, not water and not energy efficiency, for the other ones, you would just have to get 88 points. However, you could get those points in the other chapter categories or the other green practice categories. And then the choice you would have was, do you want to follow the performance path? If you were following the performance path, what you would do is calculate the baseline energy and water use for the building as is. So the verifier would be going in and working with the building owner to figure out how much energy and water is that building using today. and then plan to implement practices and improvements so that they can get a reduction in energy use and water use depending on the certification level they want. So again, if they want to go for bronze, they would need to get a 15% reduction in energy use and a 20% reduction in water use. One of the things I want to mention is we have quite a few older buildings coming in, and they can easily attain those higher levels of certification because they are just so poorly performing. Coming in and changing out the major systems of the building and the attributes and upgrading those to more state-of-the-art systems really can get those higher levels of savings. But there's also the opportunity to use the prescriptive path now. So this is particularly useful if the building is not as old, maybe it was built 10 years ago, and changing out the system, the HVAC system may not make sense. And so in this case, you would use the prescriptive path where you just have to get sufficient points towards certification, and you can mix and match. So you could do the performance path for energy and the prescriptive path for water, or vice versa, giving some flexibility. In addition, the 2020 said, you know, if you owned a building and you had been doing upgrades in the last 3 years, and you can document that, we can recognize that in the certification process. So as long as there's sufficient documentation what the baseline conditions were, those can be considered towards certification. And these would be the points for certification for the prescriptive path for water and energy. So again, you can either use that performance path or the prescriptive path, and these are the point requirements. Chapter 12 is brand new to the 2020 NGBS. I'm really excited to see how this will be used. This is a new certification level, certified. So you would have bronze, silver, gold, emerald, and certified. This would only be available for single-family homes and townhomes and duplexes. And the idea here was the consensus committee really wanted to figure out how could the NGBS be more relevant to single-family home builders. If you think back to those original numbers that I mentioned and how we lag a little bit in single-family compared to multifamily. So the idea here was to really figure out, particularly for volume builders, how to make the NGBS something that provides value and that they want to pursue. One of the challenges for higher volume single family builders, or even builders that are new to the program, is that the point system that we have, as I mentioned, 1,100 points, hundreds of practices, the minimum requirements in each chapter, can be really complex for bigger builders. So the average national builder may have 40, 50 models, and then with all the change outs that we have, it would require the verifier to literally have hundreds and hundreds of scoring spreadsheets. So the certified path takes a different approach. It's more like Energy Star, if you're familiar with that. It's a binary approach. You're either compliant and certified or you're not. All the practices in this chapter are mandatory. So the buildings, the homes must be compliant in order to earn certification. Most of the mandatory practices that were in the previous chapters, 5 through 10, are included in here, so they must be done. And then what the consensus committee did was really focus in on those most impactful green measures for energy and water efficiency, moisture and mold management, and indoor environmental quality. A home that is compliant with Chapter 12 is going to be roughly 7.5% more efficient than a home compliant with the 2018 IECC. And then importantly, and this is really important, because of the NGBS's, NGBS Green specifically is requirement for 100% third-party verification, we know that increased QA can ensure that those homes truly are compliant. When we speak to our verifiers who are out in the field and doing verification, for example, the number one thing they report back to us is that insulation is not always installed correctly. No malfeasance, just they're in a rush, they're trying to get the job done, often they're paid by piece, and the verifier is there to make sure before the drywall goes up that that insulation gets installed correctly. So super excited about the QA that the certification program can provide for single family homes that go through and use this certification path. And then back to the commercial space, Chapter 13 in the 2020 NGBS deals with that space in the building that is not residential. So the retail or the commercial, it must be less 49% or less than the gross floor area of the building. And there are essentially two different options that building owners and developers have. Well, first, it's always voluntary to certify the space. They do not have to choose to certify the commercial space. They can just get the residential portion certified. But if they do choose to certify the non-residential space, they can either choose to certify core and shell or the full fitted out portion. They can't do this commercial space alone. It always has to be done in conjunction with the residential space, but that would be their option. And the commercial space is similar to what we just talked about for the single family home certified path. The certification will be, level will be certified, and all the practices are mandatory. So we're not, even if the multifamily building, the residential portion is attaining, let's say, a silver or gold certification, if they choose to get that commercial space certified, it would just be at that certified level. There's not a level associated with it. So the core and shell option would be the verifier going in and making sure that the exterior air barrier, insulation, air sealing, fenestration requirements meet the requirements in the NGBS, and that would be verified at the time of certification. So sometime before the building was certified for the residential portion, we would make sure that the verifier is also going in and doing that additional core and shell certification and verification. For the full fitted out certification option, there are a whole host of practices in Chapter 13 that would have to be compliant with, and verification and certification can either occur at the same time as the residential portion or after. It depends on the leasing schedule. So oftentimes the developer or the builder will lease up that residential portion but not quite have tenants yet for their retail space. They could come back in later once they figure out who their tenant is and get that space certified. Lots of different requirements with regard to energy efficiency for Chapter 13. Here are just some of them. And again, all of the practices in Chapter 13 would be mandatory for that commercial space should they seek certification. That's everything that I have today. I hope that this has been a useful introduction for the 2020 NGBS. My contact information is here. I hope that you reach out to me if you have individual questions later on. And come and visit our website at homeinnovation.com/green.